7 children stood on that train platform in the freezing cold, and pinned to each of their coats was a label: troublemaker, defective, sickly, wild, strange, mute, unknown. That's what the world called them. Damaged goods, unwanted. A wealthy man stepped forward to claim 2 of the boys, not to love them, but to work them in his mines. When the oldest girl, just 14 years old, tried to stop him, he struck her across the face. That's when Elijah Thornton saw red. He was a broken man. His wife had died 4 months ago, and he'd spent every night since reaching for her in the dark. He had no business taking in 7 children. He could barely keep himself alive. But when he looked at those kids with their cruel labels, he saw something everyone else had missed. He saw himself. "These children are not unwanted," he said, and one by one, he tore every label off and let the wind scatter them like dead leaves. What he didn't know was that one of those children carried a secret that would change everything, a connection to the wife he'd lost. What you'll discover, the people society throws away, are often the ones with the most to give. The meaning, family isn't made by blood. It's made by choosing each other when the world says you're not worth choosing. If you believe every child deserves to be wanted, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment. Have you ever been labeled by people who never took the time to know you? Share this story with someone who needs to remember that being unwanted just means you haven't found your people yet. 4 months. That was how long Sarah had been gone. 4 months of a silence so heavy it felt like it was stealing the air right out of his lungs. He would still reach for her in the dark, only to find cold sheets and the faint smell of lavender on her pillow. He stood by the kitchen window, his coffee cold, staring out at the Thornton Creek Ranch. 500 acres of land that felt as empty as he did. The roses Sarah planted by the porch were now just thorny sticks. He had not touched the curtains she hung since the funeral. "You are not eating again." The voice belonged to Tom Walker, his deputy badge glinting in the pale light. "I do not need a babysitter, Tom. No, you need a friend to tell you that you look like death warmed over." Tom poured himself a cup of coffee. "When was the last time you got more than 2 hours of sleep?" Elijah did not answer. He could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face, her hand growing cold in his. And underneath those nightmares were the older ones from the war. "I came out here for a reason," Tom said gently. "There is an orphan train coming through Elkhorn Crossing." Tom continued, "The Children's Aid Society is hoping good Christian families will take them in." A tone in Tom's voice made Elijah wary. "No, Tom," I said no. Elijah's cup hit the table with a crack. "I can hardly keep myself going. What on earth makes you think I could handle a child?" Tom was silent for a moment. "Because Sarah would have wanted you to." Her name was like a punch to the gut. Elijah gripped the counter until his knuckles turned white. "Get out, Eli. I said get out." Tom left, but the sound of his boots had barely faded when a distant train whistle cut through the valley like a lonesome cry. Elijah told himself he was not going. It was not his problem. He had enough ghosts of his own. But his hands were already grabbing his coat. The ride to Elkhorn Crossing felt long. His horse, Rust, moved carefully along the frozen ground. Elijah kept his eyes down, trying to ignore the feeling that he was being pulled toward something he could not avoid. The town looked like a scar on the gray landscape. A handful of buildings, a general store, a saloon, and the train station, where a small crowd had gathered in the biting cold. Elijah tied up Rust and made his way toward the platform. He heard the yelling before he saw what was happening. "Get your hands off of me!" It was a girl's voice, full of fire and fear. "Do not you touch her!" The crowd had made a circle, watching but doing nothing. Elijah pushed his way to the front, and the sight turned his blood cold. 7 children stood there. The oldest, a girl of about 14 with reddish-brown hair, was trying to shield the others behind her like a she-wolf. A man in a fancy hat, who Elijah knew to be Silas Crenshaw, the richest man in the county, had a grip on a little boy's arm. "This one looks sturdy enough," Crenshaw said to the woman next to him. "I can always use another hand in the mines." "He is not going anywhere without me," the girl shouted. She lunged, and Crenshaw struck her across the face with the back of his hand, sending her to the ground. The little one started to cry. In that moment, something inside Elijah Thornton that had been frozen solid for months finally cracked. He moved without thinking. In 3 long strides, he was there. His hand clamped down on Crenshaw's wrist with so much force the man yelped. "Let him go!" Crenshaw's face turned purple with rage. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" "I am the man who just watched you hit a child," Elijah said, his voice deadly quiet. It was the same voice he used in the war right before things went bad. "And I think if you do not take your hands off that boy, you are going to find out what I learned at Antietam." The crowd went dead silent. Crenshaw looked around for help and found none. He let the boy go, who scurried back to the others. The boy hid behind the older girl as she got back to her feet. Her lip was bleeding, but her eyes were fixed on Elijah, a mix of thanks and distrust in them. "These children are the property of the Children's Aid Society," Crenshaw snarled. "You have no right." "They are not property," Elijah said, turning to face him. "They are children. And unless you have papers saying you legally adopted that boy, you have no claim on him." "I do not need papers. Nobody wants them anyway," Crenshaw sneered, waving a hand at the little group. "Look at them. The woman from the society said they were nothing but trouble. Unwanted." That word, unwanted, just hung in the cold air. For the first time, Elijah truly looked at the children. 7 of them, huddled together. Their clothes were thin and ragged, not nearly warm enough for a Wyoming winter. And pinned to each little coat was a paper label. The oldest girl, troublemaker. A dark-haired boy standing silently, defective. A little girl with blonde curls trying to smile, sickly. A smaller boy with freckles, wild. A serious-looking girl of about 7, strange. A tiny girl of 5 who was trying to hide behind the oldest, mute. And the smallest one of all, a little 4-year-old clutching a dirty doll, unknown. A hot mix of rage and grief twisted in Elijah's gut. "Who put these on them?" he asked, his voice rough. Crenshaw just shrugged. "The society woman. She called it truth in advertising." Truth. Elijah reached out slowly, so the oldest girl would not be scared. She stood perfectly still as he unpinned the paper from her coat. Troublemaker. He balled it up in his fist. Then he moved down the line, taking off every single label, crushing every lie. Defective, sickly, wild, strange, mute, unknown. He let the crumpled papers fall to the wooden platform, and the wind scattered them like dead leaves. "These children," Elijah said, his voice ringing out for everyone to hear, "are not unwanted." Crenshaw laughed out loud. "Oh, really? Then I suppose you are going to take all 7 of them? A bachelor rancher who can barely feed himself?" "That is exactly what I'm going to do." The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, but as soon as he said them, he knew they were true. The crowd started whispering. The oldest girl's eyes went wide with disbelief. "You are out of your mind," Crenshaw stated. "Maybe I am." Elijah knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. He could see how tired she was, how much weight she had been carrying. "What is your name?" She looked at the other children, then back at him. "Grace," she said. "Grace Whitmore." "Grace," he said the name softly. "I am Elijah Thornton. I have a ranch about an hour from here. 500 acres. A big house with empty rooms." He paused. "Too many empty rooms." "Why?" Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you want us? You do not know us." I know what I saw, Elijah said, his voice steady. I saw a young woman ready to fight a grown man to protect her family. I saw children who have been told they are worthless by people who never even tried to know them. He stood up. I am not asking for your trust. That has to be earned. But I am offering you a warm house, beds, and food. I am offering you a choice. You can all come with me, or you can stay here and wait for someone else to decide your future for you. He met her stare. Their future is your decision, Grace, all of them. Grace turned to the children behind her. A quiet boy named Sam watched with eyes that had seen far too much. A little blonde girl, Hannah, cried without a sound. Billy, a boy with freckles, balled up his fists, ready to take on the world. Young Maddie was frozen in place, her lips moving as if in prayer. Lucy held on to Grace's coat with two small hands, while tiny Abby hid her face in Lucy's shoulder. Grace knelt down and spoke softly to each one, taking in their quiet answers. Then she stood up to face Elijah. Her voice was low and steady. If you cause any of them harm, I will find you while you sleep. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Elijah just nodded. He understood. That wagon ride back to the ranch was the longest hour of his life. He had borrowed a wagon from Clara Henderson, filled with blankets and supplies. The children huddled together in the back, their breath making little clouds in the cold air. Grace sat beside him, her back ramrod straight, staring down the trail. She hadn't said a word since they left town. That quiet boy, Elijah finally said. Sam, is he unable to speak like the little one? No, Grace's voice was sharp. He can talk. He just doesn't. Why is that? That is his own story to tell. Elijah gave a slow nod. He knew all about keeping things locked away inside. He tried a different question. The smallest one, Abby. Her tag said her past was unknown. What is that about? Grace's jaw grew tight. It means no one knows where she came from. She was on the train out of New York, but she was not on any official list. No papers, no history, nothing. Just a little girl in a blue dress, holding a doll. And you took her in. What was I supposed to do? Leave her behind? No. Elijah glanced back at the small children, trying to stay warm. You did the right thing. Grace seemed to relax just a bit, but her voice was still like stone. You ought to know something, Mr. Thornton. It's Elijah. Mr. Thornton, she repeated firmly. We have been in 12 homes over the last 2 years. 12 families decided we were too much trouble. Too many of us. Too wild. Too broken. She finally looked right at him. Every single one of them made promises. Every single one of them broke those promises. I am not like them. That is what they all said. Elijah did not argue. He knew she was right to be wary, right to protect those children. All he could do was show her she was wrong. The ranch house appeared in the twilight, a ghost of wood and memory. Elijah stopped the wagon and hopped down. Behind him, he heard the children stirring, the first real sounds he had heard from most of them. Is this your place? Billy asked, his voice filled with wonder. All of it? It is huge. It is cold, Grace stated plainly. There is no smoke from the chimney. When was the last fire in there? The question felt like a slap. Elijah did not answer. He led them into the cold, empty house. The dark fireplace, the dusty furniture, the drawn curtains all reminded him of the world he had tried to shut out. Right. He went to the hearth and started gathering kindling, feeling 7 pairs of eyes on him. I will get this going. Grace, the kitchen is through there. You should find some canned goods. Sam? The silent boy looked at him. Would you check the barn? There is a horse that needs water and hay. Sam said nothing, but after a moment he headed for the door. I will help, Billy said, right behind him. Stay together, Grace called out. Both of you. The fire finally caught, and Elijah carefully built it up until warmth and light filled the room. He turned and saw the other children watching, their faces a mix of fear and weariness. Hannah had her arm around Maddie. Lucy stood close to Grace's side, and little Abby was staring at the mantelpiece. Elijah followed her gaze, and his heart seized up. It was Sarah's wedding photograph. He had forgotten to put it away with all the other painful memories. Pretty lady, Abby said in a soft voice. the first words he had heard her speak. Yes, Elijah's voice was hoarse. She was. Where is she? The innocent question filled the quiet room. She is. He struggled to find the words. She is gone, sweetheart. She passed on a few months back. Abby nodded slowly, taking it in with a child's simple understanding. My mama went away too, she said, but she promised someone would take care of me. The way she said it, the tilt of her head, the shape of her eyes, it all felt strangely familiar. It made Elijah's chest ache. Abby, he asked gently, do you remember your mama's name? The little girl shook her head. Just Mama. But she had a picture just like that one. She pointed to Sarah's photo. She said it was her sister. She said her sister would find me one day. The room fell silent. Grace was looking from him to Abby and back again. Mr. Thornton, she said carefully. Your wife. Did she have a sister? Elijah felt like he could not get enough air. He could only look at the little girl who looked so much like Sarah it hurt. Yes, he managed to say, she did. Emily. She was younger by 3 years. She left for California before we were married. We lost touch after that. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into a terrible picture. Emily had written once, years ago, saying she was married and happy. Then there was nothing. Sarah had always worried, but the journey was too far and too costly. Now Sarah was gone, and it seemed Emily was gone too. But Emily's daughter was here, in his house. Oh, Lord, Elijah whispered. The next few hours were a whirlwind. They ate simple beans and cornbread, the only thing Elijah could fix for 7 hungry children. He gave the 3 older children the spare room. The 4 little ones took Sarah's sewing room. Grace managed everything like a general. She made sure every child ate and washed up. She checked all the beds and the locks on the doors, but her eyes kept going back to Abby. You truly believe she's your late wife's kin? Grace asked once the little ones were asleep. They kept their voices low in the dim hallway. Sam was back from the barn, sitting quietly in the kitchen with Billy, the 2 of them saying nothing but understanding everything. Elijah ran a hand through his hair. I reckon so. There are too many things lining up for it to be nothing. The way she looks, her story about her mama having a sister, the age, it all fits. Grace's brow tightened. But if her mother Emily knew she had a sister out here, why not send Abby straight to you? Why put her on a train with no name and no papers? Maybe she was sick or in some kind of trouble, Elijah reasoned. Maybe that train was the only way to get her safe. Safe from what? He had no answer for that. We have to find out for sure, Grace insisted. For Abby. Agreed, Elijah said, meeting her gaze. First thing tomorrow, I'll write the society. Find out who put her on that train. Grace gave a slow nod. For the first time, she looked less like a hardened survivor and more like the 14-year-old girl she was. Mr. Thornton. Elijah, he corrected gently, but she paid him no mind. If she does turn out to be your wife's niece, are you going to keep just her? The question hit him right where he lived. She was really asking, what about the rest of us? He waited for her to look at him. Grace, I didn't bring any of you here on account of blood. I brought you here because you needed a place to land, and I had one to give. That fact hasn't changed one bit. You are all here, and you are all staying. Unless you decide otherwise. No arguments. She looked him over for a long spell, searching his face for the catch, for the crack in the promise that always came. She didn't find one. We'll see, she finally said, then turned to check on the children. Elijah stood alone in the hallway, the sound of creaking floorboards and quiet whispers filling the empty spaces of the house. He thought of Sarah, of the children she'd always wanted. She would have loved these 7 tough, beautiful, broken kids. He made a silent promise deep in his heart where it counted. I will take care of them, Sarah. All of them. The wind howled outside, But for the first time in 4 long months, Elijah Thornton had a reason to keep the fire burning warm inside. He found a little sleep that night, though it was restless. In his dreams, Sarah smiled at him, and 7 children ran laughing through a field of roses. The morning calm was shattered by the sound of breaking glass and a child's scream. He was out of bed and down the hall in a heartbeat, old instincts kicking in. In the kitchen, Billy stood frozen, a busted jar of preserves at his feet. Red jam spread across the floor like a bad omen. "I didn't mean to," the boy whispered, his face pale. "I was just hungry. Please don't." He threw his arms up to cover his head. Elijah stopped dead in his tracks. He knew that posture. He had seen it in good men, broken by bad officers. "Billy," he said, his voice low and steady. "Look at me, son." The boy's arms stayed put. "I am not going to hit you, you hear me? I will not lay a hand on you." Slowly, Billy lowered his arms. His eyes were shiny with tears he refused to let fall. This was a boy who had learned early on that crying just made things worse. "It was an accident," Elijah said plainly. "These things happen, you understand?" Billy nodded, wound tight as a spring. "Now, you said you were hungry," Elijah continued. The boy nodded again. "All right, then, let's get some real food in you. But first, we clean this up. You know where the broom is?" "No, sir." "Pantry to your left. Go fetch it." Billy moved like he expected a strike the second his back was turned. But when he came back with the broom, he found Elijah already on his knees picking up the big pieces of glass. Some of the tension eased out of the boy's shoulders. They cleaned up the mess without a word. Then Elijah made a real breakfast. Eggs, bacon, and biscuits from a recipe Sarah had taught him. The smell brought the others from their rooms. Grace came first, her eyes taking everything in. Then Silent Sam slipped into a chair. Hannah followed, trailed by Maddie, Lucy, and little Abby, who clutched her worn-out doll. 7 children at his table. 7 sets of eyes looking at him with a mix of fear and hope. 8 plates, Elijah announced, putting them down. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Grace's eyes narrowed. "What kind of work?" "This place has gone to pot while I've been away." "You mean while you've been grieving?" Maddie said, her voice quiet but clear. Her dark eyes were too knowing for a 7-year-old. "It is okay to say it. God understands grieving. He gave it to us so we would know what we lost." The table fell silent. Elijah just looked at the little girl who spoke like a preacher. "That is a very wise thing to say, Maddie." "My papa used to say it. He was a minister," she said, her voice steady. "Before those men hurt him and Mama on the road." Hannah gasped, and Grace put a comforting hand on Maddie's shoulder. "I am sorry about your parents," Elijah said softly. "It was God's will," Maddie replied. "I do not understand it, but I will one day." Billy snorted. "God's will. A lot of good that did them. Maybe God should have stopped the men instead." "That is enough," Grace snapped. "We do not talk about that." "Why not? It happened." "I said that is enough." The air in the room grew thick with old pain. "Eat your breakfast," Elijah said, his voice firm. "All of you. There is a time for talking about God, and it is not right now. First food, then work." Billy scowled but picked up his fork. Maddie bowed her head, maybe in prayer. Grace just watched Elijah, sizing him up, and he wondered if he was passing her test. The morning was a blur of work. Elijah gave out jobs based on what he had seen. Sam and Billy were with him in the barn. Sam moved with a quiet knowing around the horses, and Billy needed to burn off the nervous energy that buzzed inside him. Grace would run the house with Hannah's help since she was clearly used to it. He put Maddie in charge of organizing the pantry. Lucy and Abby were to stay close to Grace. "So you're giving us chores?" Grace stated when he was done. It wasn't a question. "No, I am giving you responsibilities." "There is a difference," he replied. "Chores are to keep kids busy. Responsibilities are for folks you are counting on to help." Elijah held her gaze. "And I need help, Grace. This ranch is too much for one man. I was wrong to think otherwise. So yes, I am asking you to work. But I will not ask you to do anything I'm not doing myself. And it comes with a reward. A roof and food, for starters. An education. I will teach you all to read and write. And when you are old enough, if you choose to stay, I will pay you a fair wage, same as any other hand." Grace looked stunned. "Nobody has ever offered us wages," she said, her voice low. "Most folks just treated us like free labor. Worked us till we couldn't stand. Well, I am not most folks." "No," she said after a long moment. "I am starting to see that." She turned and headed for the house, calling for Hannah. Elijah let out a small breath he didn't know he was holding. One step at a time. That was how you built trust. In the barn, Elijah showed Sam and Billy the morning routine. Sam worked with a quiet skill, never saying a word. Billy, on the other hand, filled the silence with constant chatter, throwing himself into the work with a frantic energy. "So this here is your horse, Rust? That is a good name for him. He is a big fella. Is he fast?" "I bet he is fast. I knew a fellow who had a horse, but it was small like a pony. Have you ever been on a pony? They are mean. That is what I heard. Hey, Sam, you ever ridden one?" Sam shook his head, a small smile on his face. "Me neither. But I want to learn to ride a real horse, a big one like this. Do you think Mr. Thornton would teach me?" "Billy," Elijah's voice cut in. "Breathe." The boy looked down. "Sorry, I talk a lot. The lady at the last place said my mouth would get me in trouble one day. She said nobody wants a boy who talks all the time. She was wrong." Billy looked up, surprised. She was. Talking is not a crime, and being curious is a good thing. Elijah picked up a bale of hay. "But there is a time for talking and a time for working. Right now we work. You can ask your questions at supper. You will answer them, if I am able." A look of pure hope spread across Billy's face, so bright that Elijah had to turn away. How long had it been since anyone had made this boy a promise they intended to keep? Sam, who had watched the whole thing, moved a little closer to Billy. He did not speak, but his presence was a clear sign of support. Elijah saw it then. These children took care of each other. They were a family, made strong by their shared troubles. Each one had a job to do. Grace was the leader, Sam the quiet protector, and Billy was the one who drew all the fire. They had survived because they held on to each other when the world tried to pull them apart. Now, it was his job to build a place where they could finally let go. Around noon, riders appeared. Elijah heard the 3 horses coming. He put down the fence post he was holding and walked toward the house, his hand resting near his pistol. Silas Crenshaw sat on a fine black horse, with 2 hard-faced men beside him. Thornton. Crenshaw's voice was as smooth as oil. "We need to have a word. Then talk." Crenshaw swung down from his horse. "I was thinking about our chat at the station. Maybe I was a little too quick to judge. Those children belong with me now. Are you sure about that?" Crenshaw smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You are a man alone out here, Thornton. You have no wife, no family to speak for you. Around here, folks don't take kindly to a single man raising children, let alone 7 of them who've been called trouble. Those were lies, and you know it." "Do I now?" Crenshaw spread his hands out, looking as innocent as a fox in a hen house. "I just know what I saw. A little girl who came at me in town, a boy who won't say a word. Another child so peculiar the other kids give her a wide berth. These ain't normal children, Thornton. They're damaged." Elijah felt that old fire churning in his gut. The same heat that got him through the war and the long, dark years after. He pushed it down. "What do you want, Crenshaw?" "Straight to the point. I like that." Crenshaw stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Here's the deal. You give me the 2 oldest boys. They're strong enough to be useful. In return, I'll forget all about yesterday's trouble. I might even put in a good word for you when the territory men come asking about this little setup of yours. Think hard, Thornton. Think hard. It's you against the law. I've got friends in the government. Friends who'd be real interested to hear an unstable veteran is keeping 7 orphans without the proper paperwork. I have the paperwork. filed in Laramie. Crenshaw's smirk flickered for just a second. Well, paperwork can be challenged, especially when the well-being of children is in question. Are you threatening me? Just a friendly warning. Crenshaw swung back up onto his horse. I'm a patient man, Thornton, but those kids would be better off with folks who know how to handle them. Folks who can give them discipline and a purpose, like working in your mines. Exactly. Contributing to society, not draining it. Crenshaw pulled on his reins. You think on my offer. I'll be back. He rode off, his men trailing behind him. Elijah watched him disappear over the rise before he turned and saw Grace on the porch. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. He's gonna try and take us. He's gonna try. Some of the families that got rid of us before, they were paid by men like him. Men who wanted hands to work, not children to raise. Grace's fists were clenched tight. He'll find a way, they always do. Not this time. How do you know? Elijah walked to the bottom of the steps. Because I've known men like Crenshaw my whole life. In the war, in business, in every town I've been through. They think their money and power mean they can take whatever they want. And they all make the same mistake. They see that I'm quiet, and they think I'm weak. He met her eyes. I will fight for y'all, Grace. Down to my last breath if I have to. Something in her gaze shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was close. Maybe she saw a fellow spirit who knew what it was to protect your own. The others are scared, she said softly. Lucy heard the horses and started crying. Abby's hiding under her bed. Even Sam looks worried, and he never looks worried. Gather 'em up, all of 'em. We're having a family meeting. The word family just hung there in the air. Grace's eyes went a little wide. Then she nodded and went inside. 7 children sat in the living room, huddled together with Grace in the middle, like she was their son. Elijah stood by the fireplace, feeling their eyes on him. I'm not going to lie to you, he said. That man, Crenshaw, he wants to take some of you. Maybe all of you. He thinks because he's a big shot, he can just do it. Billy's jaw set hard. Let him try. You'll do nothing. Elijah's voice was firm. You'll stay close to this house and your family. This isn't your fight, Billy, it's mine. But, no buts. I'm the grown-up. It's my job to keep you safe. Your job is to trust me. Trust! Grace's voice was sharp. We've trusted grown-ups before. It never ends well, I know. Elijah knelt, getting down on their level. I know you've been hurt. I know. You have no reason at all to believe me when I say I'm different. He looked from one scared face to the next. But I'm asking you to give me a chance. Just for a little while. Just long enough to prove I mean what I say. The room was dead quiet. Then Abby slid off her chair, her little rag doll hanging from her hand. She walked right up to him and looked up with those big, solemn eyes. The pretty lady in the picture, she said. Was she nice? Elijah's throat went tight. Yes, sweetheart. She was the nicest. She looks like my mama. Abby reached up and put her tiny hand on his cheek. Mama said to trust people with kind eyes. Your eyes are sad, but they're kind. Abby. Grace started to move, but Elijah raised a hand. It's all right. He covered Abby's small hand with his big one. Thank you, Abby. That means more to me than you'll ever know. The little girl gave him a real bright smile. Then she turned and climbed right into his lap like she belonged there. Elijah went still. He hadn't held a child in so long, not since. Abby snuggled against his chest with a soft sigh, and a wall he'd built inside himself cracked just a little. Well, Hannah said in a small voice, I reckon that settles it. Settles what? Billy shot back. Abby likes him. And Abby's never wrong about people. She's right, Mattie's calm voice said. The Lord speaks through children. If Abby trusts him, there's a good reason. Grace was just watching them all. She looked from Abby, curled up in Elijah's lap, to his face. Whatever she saw, there was enough. Fine, she said. We'll give you a chance. But if you hurt a single one of them, I know, you'll kill me in my sleep. A tiny smile touched her lips. Good. Don't you forget it. That night, long after the children were asleep, Elijah sat in the kitchen with his coffee and Sarah's photograph. You'd know what to do, he whispered. You always knew how to make people feel safe. The picture just smiled back. I think the little one might be Emily's girl. I think she might be your niece, Sarah. The family we always wanted. He touched the glass. I'll take care of her, all of them, I swear it. A floorboard creaked. Elijah looked up. Sam was standing in the doorway, quiet as a shadow. The boy who never spoke and the man who hadn't spoken enough for months just looked at each other. Then Sam walked over to the table and sat down. He didn't say a thing. He didn't have to. His being there said it all. I'm watching you. I'm waiting. Elijah nodded slow. Want some coffee? Sam thought about it, then shook his head. Smart boy. Stuff'll stunt your growth. Elijah took a sip of his own. You don't have to trust me yet, Sam, but I hope you will someday. Sam's face didn't change, but he didn't leave. They just sat there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the fire pop and the wind howl outside. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. The days after that found their own rhythm. Mornings started before the sun was up, with Elijah getting the fire going. Grace was always the first one up, then Sam, then the rest. Billy was a bundle of pure energy. He worked at every chore like his life depended on it, trying to prove he was worth keeping. Elijah was always telling him to slow down. I don't need rest, Billy said, after almost running clean through a fence post. I ain't tired, your body says. You're otherwise. Elijah took the boy's arm and led him to the porch. Sit, drink some water. That ain't a request. Billy sat down, scowling, but he drank the whole cup of water Elijah brought him. Nobody ever made me stop before, he said, his voice real quiet. At the other places, they just let me work till I dropped. Then they'd get mad. That's not how it works here. Why? Because you're a boy, Billy, not a mule. You need to rest and eat and just be a kid sometimes. That's not being weak. It's being human. Billy just stared at him like Elijah was speaking a whole other language. And maybe he was. Hannah turned out to be the peacemaker. Whenever the kids got to fussing, she was the one who smoothed it all over. Maddie don't mean to be creepy, she told Billy one day. She just sees things different. All that talk about God and fate, it's just how she makes sense of what happened. It's weird. Well, you talk a mile a minute and climb on everything. That's weird, too. That's not... Billy stopped. All right, maybe it's a little weird. We are all a bit different, Billy. That is what makes us a family. The word felt heavier now. Family, not just a bunch of orphans holding on to survive, but something real they were building together. Lucy was the toughest puzzle. The 5-year-old girl had not said a single thing since she got to the ranch. She stuck to Grace like a shadow, her eyes wide, watching every little thing. Elijah tried to gently draw her out with kindness and treats, but nothing seemed to work. She would just stare back with those big, silent eyes. Grace told him one night that Lucy used to talk, even sing, before the orphanage. Something bad happened, and by the time Grace found her, the words were gone. Grace admitted they were not blood sisters. None of them were. She needed a special kind of doctor, and Elijah promised to take her to Laramie. When Grace asked how he could afford the time and money, he simply said, "All of you are my responsibility now. Whatever you need, I will find a way to get it." A little bit of the hardness in Grace's face seemed to melt away. "Why?" she asked in a quiet voice. "Why do you care so much? We were just strangers last week, burdens nobody else wanted." Elijah took a moment before he spoke. He told her about a man from his hometown who was mean as a rattlesnake, never smiled, never talked to a soul. After he passed, they found his journals. They were filled with beautiful poems and stories. Turns out he had lost his entire family in a fire years ago. Instead of asking for help, he just shut everyone out. He let the world think he was mean because it was easier than showing how broken he was. Elijah looked right at Grace. "I do not want to be that man. When I saw all of you on that train platform, cast aside like you were nothing, I saw a chance to be different. I saw a chance to open doors instead of closing them." That is a nice story, Grace said, but the sharp edge was gone from her voice. It is the truth, he replied. She looked at him for a long time, then gave a slow nod. Maybe it is. She left him by the fire, alone with his thoughts. He meant every word, but saying it and doing it were two different things. Still, for that one night, 7 children were sleeping safe under his roof. They were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was not as cruel as they had been taught. That was worth fighting for. A letter came on the 8th day. It had the official seal of the Children's Aid Society of New York. His hands shook a little as he opened it. The letter confirmed his question about the child named Abby. A girl matching her description was put on a westbound orphan train. She was brought in by a very sick woman named Emily Whitfield, née Thornton, from San Francisco. The woman gave no papers, just a note with the name Abigail. She passed away 2 days later and was buried in an unmarked grave. The society could not find any of her relatives. The letter said the girl was then placed in the orphan train program. Elijah read it 3 times, his hands shaking more with each pass. Emily was Sarah's younger sister, and Abby, with her golden hair, was Emily's daughter. She was Sarah's niece. She was the only family he had left in the world. He did not even know he was crying until a small hand tugged on his shirt. Abby was looking up at him, her eyes full of worry. "Why are you sad?" He knelt down to her level. "I am not sad, sweetheart. I am happy." "But you are crying." "Sometimes folks cry when they are happy," he explained, "especially when they find something they thought was lost forever." Abby thought about that. "Like when I found my doll, Rosie?" she asked, holding up the ragged toy. "I lost her on the train and I cried when I found her." "Yes," Elijah's voice cracked. "Just like that." "What did you find?" He looked at this little girl, this miracle sent to him. "You," he said softly. "I found you, Abby." Abby smiled, a bright, trusting smile that both broke his heart and put it back together. "Good. I was hoping you would find me. Mama said you would." She wrapped her little arms around his neck, and he held on tight. He held this gift from his dead wife's dead sister, and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone upstairs was listening. Grace found him on the kitchen floor with Abby in his arms. "What is wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. He looked up, and the look on his face stopped her cold. "She is Sarah's niece," he said, his voice rough. "Abby, she is my wife's kin. Her sister Emily died in New York all alone. She put Abby on that train, just hoping someone good would find her." Grace's eyes went to the little girl. "Are you sure?" "The society confirmed it," he said, holding up the crumpled letter. "Sarah always wanted children, and now her sister's daughter is here." Grace's voice softened. "That is not just luck, that is fate." Maddie would likely say it was the Lord's plan, and maybe she was right. Abby pulled away from Elijah's hug, her eyes darting between the adults. Grace knelt down beside her and said, "We found out something important, little one." Abby's face lit up. "Something good?" Grace glanced at Elijah, who gave a small nod. "Mr. Thornton's wife," Grace said softly, "was your mama's own sister. That makes him your uncle, Abby, your real blood kin." The little girl's face scrunched up. "Like a papa?" The question just hung there in the quiet room. "If you want him to be," Elijah managed to say. Abby reached out, touching his cheek just like she did that first night. "Mama told me family would come find me. She said I had to be brave, and they would come." She gave a small smile. "You came." Elijah hugged her tight, hiding his face in her hair to conceal the tears. When he looked up, he saw a new understanding in Grace's eyes. "You really are not ever giving us up," she said, and it was not a question. "Never," he answered. She nodded once and started to leave, but paused in the doorway. The others need to hear about Abby, about who she is to you. I will tell them at supper. Good. Grace hesitated a moment. And Elijah? It was the first time she had ever used his name. Thank you for not making this about blood, for choosing all of us. You are all my children now, Grace. Every last one of you. Blood is just what you are born with. Family is who you choose to stand by. She walked away, but Elijah could have sworn he saw her wipe at her eyes. The news shot through the house like a bolt of lightning. Billy was the first to explode. So Abby is your real kin? For real? Does that mean she gets to stay with us forever? Do we all get to stay? I am not related to y'all by blood, Elijah explained. But we are a family. There is a difference. What kind? Blood is something you cannot change. Family is something you choose. Billy grew quiet for a second. So you chose us? All of you. I surely did. Even me? Even after I break things and talk too much? Especially you, Billy. The boy's tough face just crumpled. He threw himself at Elijah, hugging him so hard they almost fell over. Nobody ever chose me before, Billy whispered into his shirt. Elijah held the boy tight. You are chosen now, son, and that is not ever going to change. Hannah and Maddie accepted the news quietly. Hannah just smiled and said she always knew Abby was special. Maddie declared that the Lord works in mysterious ways, which was just like her. Lucy, of course, said nothing at all, but when Abby came over to show her the letter, Lucy reached out and gently touched her golden hair. Sam was the last one. He had been watching from a corner with those quiet eyes of his. After everyone else had settled down, he walked right up to Elijah. They stood there in the firelight, a man and a boy who had both seen too much. Sam reached into his pocket and held out his hand. On his palm was a small chess piece, a white knight carved from bone. It was my father's, Sam said. His voice was raspy, barely a whisper. It was the first time Elijah had ever heard him speak. He gave it to me, told me to give it to a man I trusted. Sam looked right into Elijah's eyes. I trust you. Elijah took the knight, feeling its weight. This boy, who had been silent for so long, had finally found a reason to speak. I will take good care of it, Elijah promised, and I will take care of you. Sam gave a single nod, then turned and walked off. Grace, who saw the whole thing, looked just as stunned as Elijah felt. He has not spoken a word in 2 years, she said quietly, after Sam was gone. Not since. Since what? Grace's face hardened. Since he watched his mother get killed right in front of him. He was only 10 years old. The horror of it struck Elijah like a punch. He tried to save her, but he was just a boy. They found him 3 days later, still sitting right there beside her. He had not said a word until tonight. Elijah looked down at the small chess piece. Why me? He asked. Why now? I do not know, Grace whispered. But whatever it is you are doing for us, whatever you are giving us, do not stop. I will not. Promise me, I promise. She looked at him for a long moment, and seeing no doubt in his eyes, she finally nodded. Then maybe we can be a real family. That peace held for 3 more days. On the 4th morning, Elijah was woken by the sound of horses coming in hard and fast. He was dressed with his gun belt on before they even reached the house. It was Crenshaw, and he had brought company this time. 6 men were with him, 2 of them wearing deputy badges. A wagon followed behind, driven by a stern-looking woman dressed all in black. Grace was suddenly at his side, her face pale. That is Mrs. Harwick from the Children's Aid Society. She is the one who put the labels on us. Elijah's jaw clenched. Get the children inside, all of them, and do not let them out for anything. He walked out to meet the riders alone. His hand rested on his revolver, a casual but clear warning. Crenshaw swung down from his horse. Mr. Thornton, I told you I would be back. You did. And I told you not to waste your time. Crenshaw gestured to the lawmen, Deputy Marshal Hawkins and Deputy Marshal Reed. They are here to inspect your living arrangements. On whose authority? On the authority of the Children's Aid Society of New York, Mrs. Harwick said as she climbed down from her wagon. I have received a report that you are keeping 7 children here without proper authorization. They are wards of my organization. I have authorization papers filed in Laramie. Filed, Mrs. Harwick said with a sniff, is not the same as approved. There is a process, Mr. Thornton. You have ignored all of it. I ignored nothing. I took in children your society abandoned on a train platform in the dead of winter. Children you labeled like damaged goods. We labeled them according to professional assessments, she snapped. With words like defective and unwanted by folks who never even knew their names, Elijah's voice grew louder. I have seen what your labels do, Mrs. Harwick. You did not assess those children. You sentenced them. How dare you? Enough, Deputy Marshal Hawkins said, stepping forward. His face was weathered and neutral. Mr. Thornton, we are not here to take the children. Not right now. We are just here to see the situation. If things are right and proper, you have nothing to fear. And if they are not, we will talk about what happens next. I have kids of my own, Mr. Thornton, Hawkins said, his gaze steady. I do not take them from a good home, but I have to see for myself that this is one. Elijah sized up the lawman and saw only a man doing his job. Fine, he said. You can have a look. But Crenshaw stays outside. Now hold on here, Crenshaw sputtered. This is my land. You have no right. Elijah looked at Hawkins. Is that going to be a problem? The deputy glanced at Crenshaw, then shook his head. Mr. Crenshaw is just a concerned citizen. He is not needed inside. Crenshaw's face turned red, but he backed away, fuming. Elijah led the deputies and Mrs. Harwick into the house. The children were all there in the main room, just as he had told Grace. 7 little faces stared back, a mix of fear and defiance. Grace stood before them, chin high. Behind her, Sam stood near the little ones like a guard. Billy had his fists clenched tight. Hannah held on to Maddie and Lucy, while Abby just watched with her wide, curious eyes. Mrs. Harwick's gaze passed over them all, cold and distant. I see they are all here, the woman said. Good. I will need to speak with each of them alone. No. Grace's voice was sharp as a knife. Excuse me? Grace stood her ground. I said no. You do not get to separate us. You do not get to pull us into rooms and twist our words. I know how this works. You twist things until the truth gets lost. My name is Grace, she said, cutting the woman off. Not young lady, not troublemaker. Grace. Mrs. Harwick's face grew tight. This is the kind of defiance I wrote about in my reports. This child, Elijah stepped in, has a history of protecting her family when the adults in her life failed her. That is not defiance, that is courage. You want to interview the children? Fine. But you will do it right here in front of me, where we can all hear the questions and the answers. The official named Hawkins nodded. That seems reasonable, Mrs. Harwick. It is highly irregular, she snapped. So is calling children defective, Hawkins replied with an edge in his voice. Ask your questions. The questions that followed were like walking a tightrope. Mrs. Harwick asked about their chores, their food, and how they were disciplined. Has Mr. Thornton ever hit you? She asked Billy. No, ma'am, he replied. He only raises his voice when I'm about to do something foolish and get myself hurt. That is not anger. That is caring. Does he make you work too hard? He makes us rest when we are tired, Hannah said quietly. He says children are not machines. Has he ever touched you in a bad way? Grace's face turned white with fury. How dare you ask that? It is a standard question, Mrs. Harwick said. It is an insult, Grace shot back, her voice shaking. Elijah Thornton is the first grown-up who has ever treated us like we are human beings. He teaches us, he feeds us, and he sits with us when we have bad dreams. He has never made us feel unsafe. The record says Mr. Thornton is a war veteran with a history of violence. The war was 15 years ago, Elijah said calmly. And I have never ever raised a hand to a child. Can you prove that, she challenged. He looked her square in the eye. Can you prove otherwise? There was a long silence. Mr. Hawkins finally cleared his throat. I have seen enough, Mrs. Harwick. The children are healthy and well cared for. The house was clean and the fire was warm, but that woman was cold as ice. Mrs. Harwick set her jaw. This is not over, Mr. Thornton. The society has rules. You might have charmed these deputies, but the board will demand a proper investigation. Then investigate, I told her. I have nothing to hide. We will see about that. And with that, she stormed out of the house with Deputy Reed right behind her. Hawkins hung back for a moment. You just made a powerful enemy, he said, his voice low. Mrs. Harwick does not like being told no. I know. Just watch your back, and watch over these children. His eyes drifted over to the 7 little faces watching us from across the room. They are lucky to have you. Not everyone would have done this. Not everyone saw what I saw. Hawkins gave a slow nod. I will file a good report, but you need to get those papers legal and proper. The sooner, the better. I will ride for Laramie tomorrow. Good. He tipped his hat. Good luck, Mr. Thornton. The second the door shut, Billy let out a huge sigh of relief. I thought for sure they were taking us away. They are not taking anyone, Elijah said, his voice firm as oak. Not now, not ever. You cannot promise that, Grace said quietly. You heard her. This is not over. No, it is not, Elijah agreed, looking at each one of them. But I meant what I said. I will fight for every last one of you for as long as I am breathing. Why? Sam's voice, raspy from not being used, cut right through the quiet room. Everyone turned to look at him. Even Grace seemed surprised. Hearing Sam talk twice in 1 week was unheard of. Why what? Elijah asked him gently. Why are you fighting so hard for us? We are not your kin. We are not your problem. You could just walk away and have a peaceful life. Why do you not do that? It was the question they had all been wondering but were too afraid to ask. Elijah thought on it for a moment. Because after my wife passed, I spent 4 months wanting to follow her, he said, his voice thick with memory. 4 long months in a darkness so deep, I saw no reason to go on. Then I walked up on that train platform and saw 7 children who had been told they were worthless. And I thought, if I can give them the life they deserve, if I can prove everyone wrong about them, then maybe my own life can still mean something. He had to stop, a lump forming in his throat. You did not save me because I saved you. You all saved me by just being here. You gave me a reason to fight when I had forgotten how. So do not ask me why I am doing this. You are the reason. The room was dead silent. Then little Abby broke from the others and ran to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his legs. One by one, they all followed. Hannah had quiet tears running down her cheeks. Maddie just looked up at him with a solemn nod. Lucy, though, she came last, shaking like a leaf. She stopped a few feet away, her big eyes locked on his. Elijah knelt down to her level. It is okay, Lucy. You do not have to. But she launched herself at him, burying her little face in his shoulder. And then, so quiet he almost did not hear it, she whispered a single word. Papa. It was the first word anyone had heard her say in a very long time. Elijah held her, tears of his own streaming down his face, surrounded by the family he had chosen, and who had chosen him right back. Grace stood by herself, watching it all. She had learned the hard way that hope could hurt you. Elijah met her gaze over the top of the children's heads. I know you do not trust me yet, he said. I will wait, however long it takes. For just a second, her tough act started to crumble. Maybe, she whispered. Maybe you are different. She did not join the hug, but she did not walk away either, and for now, that was more than enough. The ride to Laramie was a hard 2-day journey. Elijah left before the sun was up with his neighbor's promise to check on the children. Grace had stood on the porch to see him off, her face a blank map. The little ones were all huddled behind her. Promise you will come back, Abby's little voice called out. I promise, sweetheart, he yelled back. 3 days, 4 at the most. But Elijah knew that promises were easy to break. The courthouse in Laramie was a grim place that smelled like old dust and disappointment. Elijah spent the first day getting shuffled from one desk to another, each person needing a different piece of paper and another fee. On the second day, he finally made it to the office of Judge Cornelius Blackwood. The judge was an old man with eyes that looked like they had seen everything twice. He read over the guardianship papers without saying a word. 7 children, Judge Blackwood said at last. That is a tall order, Mr. Thornton. It is necessary, Your Honor. Necessary. The judge put the papers down. Mrs. Harwick from the Children's Aid Society has filed an objection. She says you are unfit, that you have a violent past, and that you ignored the proper way of doing things. I served in the war, Your Honor. The violence was for my country, and I filed the paperwork the very next day. I have done everything by the book. She also claims you are telling the children what to say. Elijah felt his jaw clench. That is a lie. Maybe so, but it is a lie that sounds believable coming from her. The judge leaned back. I have read the report from Deputy Marshal Hawkins. He speaks highly of you. But I also got a letter from Silas Crenshaw. Crenshaw has his own reasons for wanting this to fail. I know he wants 2 of the boys for his mine. He even offered to make a large donation to the orphan fund if I sided with him. A cold dread washed over Elijah. You cannot. I cannot be bought, Mr. Thornton. That is what I am telling you. The judge's voice turned hard as iron. Crenshaw made a mistake thinking his money meant something here. I have seen men like him my whole life. They think a dollar can fix any problem. Then you will approve it? I will approve it conditionally. The judge slammed a heavy seal onto the papers. You have 6 months. 6 months to prove this is the right thing for these children. Someone from my court will visit every few months. If there are any problems at all, we'll be right back here. I understand. I surely hope you do, Mr. Thornton. Those children have been failed by every grown-up they have ever known. If you fail them, the consequences will be more than just legal. Elijah took the papers, his hands shaking just a little. I will not fail them, Your Honor. See that you do not. The ride home felt twice as long. He was bone-tired, but also relieved. He pushed his horse, Rust, as hard as he could, the legal papers tucked safe inside his coat. He was already thinking about his children. His children. When did that happen? When did it stop being a duty and become the most real thing in his life? He came over the last hill just as the sun was going down, expecting to see a warm light in the window. Instead, all he saw was darkness. And standing in his yard, lit by torches, was Silas Crenshaw. He had a dozen men with him. Some were local ranch hands, others were rough-looking strangers with guns at their hips, and right in the middle of them, huddled together against the cold, were the children. Grace was at the front, a trickle of blood on her lip, her arms spread wide, trying to protect the others. Behind her, Sam's face was a mask of pure fury. Billy was trembling with anger. Hannah was clutching the younger ones, trying to shield them with her own small body. All Elijah saw was red. He pulled his revolver and kicked Rust into a gallop, the horse's hooves pounding like thunder on the frozen dirt. The men turned, surprised, as he charged toward them. Crenshaw didn't budge, that slick smile spreading across his lips. Well now, Mr. Thornton, we were just keeping your little family company. Elijah's voice was cold as a grave. Get away from them. No need to get hostile. We're all civilized folks here. I said get away from them. Crenshaw's smile never left his face. I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, while you were out, I learned something mighty interesting. It seems one of your children, the quiet one, Sam, is wanted for questioning about a killing back in Kansas City. The world just stopped turning. Elijah looked at Sam. The boy's face was white as a sheet, that tough composure he always wore finally starting to crack. That's a lie, Grace spat. Is it? Crenshaw pulled a folded paper from his coat. I have a warrant here for the arrest of one Samuel James Whitmore, age 12. Wanted in connection with the death of his own father, Marcus Whitmore. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Sam's father, the man whose death had stolen the boy's voice. You're twisting things, Elijah said, his pistol still steady on Crenshaw. That boy didn't kill anybody. The warrant says he did, and until this is all sorted out, I'm authorized to take him. Of course, if you were to rethink my offer and give me the children, I might just be persuaded to lose this piece of paper. Accidents happen, you know. Papers get misplaced. You son of a— Careful, Mr. Thornton. There are little ones present. Elijah's finger grew tight on the trigger. It would be so easy. One shot, and this snake would never bother his family again. But doing that would make him a murderer and leave these children with nobody. He lowered the gun. Crenshaw's smile widened. A wise choice. Now, about our deal. No. The voice came from behind Elijah. He turned and saw Tom Walker riding in, his badge shining in the torchlight. Right behind him were Deputy Marshal Hawkins and 4 other men. This ranch is under territorial protection, Hawkins announced, his voice booming across the yard. Judge Blackwood himself approved Mr. Thornton's guardianship. Trying to take these children is kidnapping. Crenshaw's face curdled with rage. That warrant is 3 years old and was already dismissed by the court in Kansas City, Hawkins said, holding up a telegram. I checked. The boy was questioned and cleared. His father was killed by debt collectors when Samuel was 10 years old. The boy tried to stop them and was nearly killed himself. He's not a suspect. He's a victim. Elijah felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He looked at Sam, at this poor child who had carried that terrible burden all alone. For so long, he had watched his father be murdered, been blamed for it, and lost his voice from a hurt so deep it might never heal. You knew, he said to Crenshaw. You knew that warrant was no good. You used it anyway. I used the tools I had. You used a child's worst nightmare as a weapon. Elijah stepped toward him, and something in his eyes made Crenshaw's men take a step back. You took the worst day of his life and threw it in his face in front of his family. For what? For land. I am a businessman, Thornton. You are a monster, and I swear to God, if you ever come near these children again, I will end you. Law or no law, I will end you. Crenshaw's slimy smile finally vanished. He looked at the lawmen around him and saw only cold judgment. This is not over, he said, but his voice was weak. Yes, it is, Hawkins stepped forward. Mr. Crenshaw, I am placing you under arrest for attempted kidnapping and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The next few minutes were a blur of Crenshaw's sputtering protests as his men faded into the night. But Elijah didn't see any of it. He was on his knees in the cold dirt with 7 children clinging to him like he was the last solid rock in a storm. You came back, Abby sobbed against his shoulder. You came back. I told you I would, sweetheart. I promised. That mean man said you left us, like everybody else. He lied, Elijah said, pulling back to look at each of them. I will never leave you. Do you all understand me? Never. Grace stood apart, holding herself, her lip bleeding and trembling. She looked younger and more scared than he had seen her in weeks. Grace. She just shook her head, unable to look at him. I could not stop them. I tried. I fought. But there were too many of them. Her voice broke. They just walked right in, like we were nothing. Elijah stood up and went to her. He took her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the fire still in his gut. You protected them. You stood between those men and your family, and you fought anyway. That is not nothing, Grace. That is everything. I was so scared. I am always so scared. I have to be strong for them, but I am so tired of being scared. Then let me be scared for you, he said softly. Sometimes let me carry that weight. I do not know how. You learn, day by day, the same way I am, learning to be a father. Elijah gently wiped the blood from her lip. You're only 14, Grace. Life forced you to grow up too fast. It is time to let yourself be a child again, even for a little while. Her tough exterior finally cracked. For the first time, Grace Whitmore cried like the child she was, with loud, messy sobs that told of a burden too heavy to carry. Elijah wrapped his arms around her as the other children gathered, forming a protective circle, no longer just bound by trauma, but by a newfound love. "I've got y'all," Elijah murmured into her hair. "You are safe. You are home." Later, after the lawmen were gone and the children were fed and warm in their beds, Elijah sat with Sam in the quiet kitchen. The boy's silence was different now, heavy and wounded. "You do not have to talk," Elijah said gently. "But I want you to know what happened to your father was not your fault. Not then, and not now." Sam's small hands tightened into fists on the table. "I have seen men die, Sam, in the war and after. I know what death does to those left behind. The guilt, the wondering if you could have done more." A muscle twitched in Sam's jaw. "The answer is no. There was nothing you could have done. You were just a boy against grown men with guns. The fact that you tried to save him, that you survived, is something to be proud of." "I could not protect him." Sam's voice was a rusty, broken whisper. "I just watched." "You were 10 years old," Elijah said, leaning forward. "Son, if you had been able to stop them, you would be dead too. Your father knew that. He fought to give you time to run, not to save himself." "How do you know?" "Because that is what a father does." Elijah's voice grew thick with emotion. "It is what I would do for any of you." The walls inside Sam finally began to crumble. "I have been so angry," he whispered. "At them. At myself for being weak. The anger choked the words right out of me. Now I am just tired. So tired of being alone with it all." "You are not alone anymore, Sam. You have not been since you got off that train." "I know," Sam said, his eyes filling with tears held back for years. "That is the part I cannot figure out. Why us? Why would you want a broken kid who cannot even speak?" "Because you are not broken, son. You are wounded." "There is a world of difference," Elijah said, gripping Sam's shoulder. "Broken things get thrown out. Wounded things get healed. And healing takes time and someone who gives a damn. And I give a damn, Sam. About all of y'all. I am not going anywhere." Sam's control finally shattered. He lunged forward and Elijah caught him, holding the boy as 12 years of grief and anger poured out in ragged sobs. "I miss my dad," Sam choked out. "I miss him so much." "I know, son. I know." They stayed like that for a long while. A man who had lost his wife and a boy who had lost his father, finding the one thing neither expected to find again: family. The next morning was clear and cold. Elijah stood on the porch watching the children. Billy was already racing to the barn while Hannah and Maddie walked together, talking quietly. Abby ran out and threw herself around his legs. "Morning, Papa?" She had started calling him that, and the word filled his chest with a sweet ache. "Morning, sweetheart." Lucy came next, still quiet, but she paused and touched his hand. "Morning," she said softly. It was only the second word she had spoken in 3 weeks. "Good morning, Lucy." Sam was the last to come out. He looked tired, but lighter. He gave Elijah a nod, a silent understanding passing between them. Elijah found Grace in the kitchen, staring out the window. "I have been thinking about what you said," she told him, her face open and young. "About letting myself be a child. I do not know if I can, but I want to try. If you will help me." "I will help you," Elijah said, putting his hands on her shoulders. "Whatever it takes. Even if you push me away. Even if you make things hard. Especially then." Grace's eyes filled with tears again. "Why? Why would you put up with all that?" "Because that is what parents do," he smiled. "They put up with the hard parts because the good parts are worth it all. And Grace, the good parts are truly worth it." She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and hugged him tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on us." "Never," Elijah held her, this fierce, wounded girl. Never, Grace. You are my daughter now. All of you are my children, and family does not give up. Spring arrived slowly in Wyoming, a whisper of a promise. Elijah stood at Sarah's grave on the first warm day, listening to the children playing behind him. He could hear Billy's laughter from the barn and Hannah's soft singing from the garden. You should see them now, Sarah, he said quietly to the stone. They are stronger, happier. Grace gave a real smile yesterday. And Sam told a joke at supper. Can you believe it? The boy who did not speak for 2 years told a joke, and he looked so surprised when everyone laughed. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. I wish you could meet them. Abby looks so much like our Emily, but she has got your spirit, that stubborn, beautiful spirit. She asked if you are watching from heaven. I told her yes. I hope that was not a lie. He knelt and touched the cold stone. I am doing my best, Sarah. I do not know if I am the father they deserve, but I am trying every single day. I think that is what you would want. Not perfection, just love. Papa? He turned to see Abby standing there, her doll in her hand. Hey, sweetheart. Are you talking to the pretty lady? Yeah, I was just telling her all about you. What did you say? That you are brave and kind and you make me smile every day. Did she say anything back? Elijah's chest filled with that familiar ache of grief and love all tangled together. She said she is proud of you and she loves you very much. Abby nodded, real satisfied. Good. I am glad she is glad. She offered him her other hand. Hannah has breakfast on the table. She made her honey biscuits, the good ones. Elijah took her hand, letting the little girl lead him from the quiet graveside. He walked back to the house, back to the 6 other children waiting inside, and back to the life he had pieced together from the ruins of his old one. The court inspector showed up in late April. She was a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Crawford who had the kind of eyes that had seen too much trouble to be easily impressed. For 3 whole days, she watched everything on that ranch. She watched them eat, do chores, and have their lessons. She saw how the children got along with each other and how they were with Elijah. She asked a ton of questions, writing it all down, in a little leather book she kept glued to her hand. On the 3rd evening, she sat with Elijah in the kitchen. Mr. Thornton, she said, her voice flat as a skillet, I have seen plenty of men like you take in orphans. Sometimes it works out. Most times it does not. And what do you reckon about this situation? Mrs. Crawford paused for a long moment. I have never seen anything quite like this, she finally admitted. Those children are not just getting by, they are flourishing. The oldest girl, Grace, she actually laughed when I talked to her. Her file says she has not laughed in 3 years. She is learning she does not have to carry the whole world on her shoulders, Elijah said. Mrs. Crawford closed her notebook. The quiet boy, Sam. He spoke to me. He told me about that chess piece he gave you. Said it was the most important thing he had, and he trusted you to keep it safe. Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. Sam has come a real long way. They all have. And the little one, Lucy, the one who never spoke a word, she called you Papa right in front of me, twice. For just a second, Mrs. Crawford's professional face softened, showing something like pure wonder. Mr. Thornton, you have any idea what a miracle that is? The doctors said that little girl's trauma was permanent, irreversible. She just needed to feel safe is all. She needed more than that, Mrs. Crawford corrected him. She needed to believe someone would catch her. You cannot fake that. Children always know. So, what happens now? Elijah asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Crawford stood up and put her notebook in her bag. I will be filing my report with Judge Blackwood. I am recommending that your trial period be ended and that you be granted full, permanent guardianship, effective immediately. Elijah's heart nearly stopped. Are you serious? I do not joke about the welfare of children, Mr. Thornton. She held out her hand. You have done something truly special here. I hope you know that. I did not do anything special. I just loved them. Yes, she said, giving him the first real smile he had seen. And that, sir, is the whole blessed point. The letter from Judge Blackwood came 2 weeks later. Elijah had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. With his hands shaking, he called all the children into the living room. "What is wrong?" Grace asked right away, that old, tired look coming back into her eyes. Elijah held up the official-looking letter. "This is from the court, from Judge Blackwood." 7 small faces turned pale as a ghost. Billy moved to stand closer to Sam, and Hannah wrapped her arms around Maddie and Lucy. "He says," Elijah started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "He says that Mrs. Crawford's report was the most positive one she has ever written in 20 years. He says the trial period is over." "What?" Grace whispered. "What does he say?" Elijah looked at his children, tears welling up in his eyes. Because that is what they were now, his children, officially and forever. "He says you belong to me, legally, permanently. The adoption is final. Nobody can ever take y'all away from me again." For a moment, there was just silence. Then Abby let out a happy little scream and threw herself at him. The others followed, a mess of arms and legs and joyful tears. Only Sam stood frozen, his face a mask of pure disbelief. "You mean we are really... You are really my children, Sam, in every single way that counts." That was all it took. The boy's tough exterior just crumbled. He rushed across the room and wrapped his arms around Elijah, holding on so tight like he was scared to ever let go. Grace was the only one who stayed back, standing by the window. Elijah gently untangled himself from the happy pile of kids and walked over to her. "Grace?" "I do not know how to feel," she said, her voice breaking. "I wanted this so bad, for so long. A real home, a real family. But I was always so afraid it would get ripped away." "Nobody is taking anything away," Elijah promised, his voice firm. "Not now, not ever. This is your home, Grace. You are my daughter. And nothing in this world is ever going to change that." Grace finally looked at him, and all the walls she had built around her heart came tumbling down. "Papa," she whispered. It was the first time she'd ever called him that. Elijah pulled her into a hug and just held her while she cried. Grace, who had been a mother before she was even old enough to be a child. Grace, who had fought for her family with everything she had. And now Grace, who had finally let herself be a daughter again. "I have got you," he murmured into her hair. "I have got all of y'all forever." "So what happens now?" Sam asked later that night, his voice quiet. The 3 of them, Elijah, Grace, and Sam, were sitting on the porch watching the stars pop out in the big Texas sky. "What do you mean, son?" "I mean we are a real family now. What do we do next?" Elijah thought on that for a second. "Well, I suppose it looks a lot like this. We work the ranch together. We learn things together. We will have good days and bad days, but we will face every one of them together." "That is it?" Grace sounded a little let down. "Just normal life?" "Normal life is a heck of a gift, Grace. Trust me on that. After everything we have all been through, normal is the biggest blessing we could ever ask for." She was quiet for a minute, then nodded. "I guess I do not really remember what normal feels like." "Then we will just have to figure it out together," Elijah said. Sam leaned his head back, looking straight up. "The stars look different tonight." "Oh, different how?" "I do not know," Sam said. "Less cold, maybe. Not so far away." He glanced at Elijah. "That probably sounds dumb." "No, son, it does not sound dumb at all. I know exactly what you mean." Grace's voice was soft in the darkness. "Papa? Yeah? Thank you," she said, "for not just walking past us that day, for seeing us when nobody else did." Elijah smiled. "I ought to be thanking y'all. You saved my life, Grace. Every single one of you did." I was going under for the third time before you came along. You kids gave me a reason to fight for the surface. That summer came in hot and full of promise. The ranch was looking better than ever. Fences were mended and the barn had a fresh coat of paint. The kids had all found their footing. Billy was a natural with the horses and Sam had a way with the cattle. Grace ran the house with a quiet strength. And then there was Lucy. She had been a ghost in the house for so long, but now she was starting to talk. Her voice was just a whisper at first. One evening she climbed right into Elijah's lap, looked up at him and said, "Papa." He answered, "Yes, darling. You know my favorite thing about this place? What is it? Nobody calls us ugly names here anymore." Her words were simple, but her eyes held the memory of so much pain. Nobody pins papers on us. Nobody looks at us like we are trash. Elijah felt his throat tighten. "That is because you are not trash, Lucy. You never were. I know," she said with a real trusting smile. "You taught me that. A gift. You were right. All of this, it is everything I ever dreamed of. A home. A real family. People who care about me because they want to, not because they have to." She paused, looking down at the plate in her hands. "I did not think a place like this was real." "They are not," Elijah said gently. "They have to be built. Folks have to decide that the world does not have to be so cruel. Is that why you took us in? To prove a point?" "Partly. But mostly I saw 7 children who deserved a whole lot better than what life had handed them. And I had better to give." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Someday I want to help other kids. Kids like us, who got thrown away. I want to show them their story is not over yet." Elijah looked at this strong, brave girl who had become his daughter in every way that counted. "That is a fine dream, Grace. You reckon I could do it? I reckon you could do anything you set your mind to. And any child who ends up in your care will be the luckiest child on earth." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You really think so?" "I truly do." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, just like a daughter would with her father. And Elijah felt the last broken piece of his heart finally settle back into place. Fall brought gold leaves and crisp air, and with it the anniversary of the day Elijah found them. He woke up early and walked out to Sarah's grave. The children found him there about an hour later, all 7 of them standing in a line. "We wanted to come too," Billy said, "to say thank you to Miss Sarah." Abby stepped forward with a little bunch of wildflowers. "For sending you to find us. Maddie says she must have asked God for help, and God sent you." "That is what I believe," Maddie said, her eyes serious. "God works through people. He worked through you." One by one they went to the grave. Abby laid down her flowers. Billy set down a small wooden horse he had carved. Hannah left a ribbon from her hair. And Lucy whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. Grace was the last one. She knelt and put her hand on the cold stone. "I never got to meet you," she said softly. "But I know you were special. Because the man who loved you, he saved us. He gave us a home and a future." Her voice got thick with emotion. "I promise I will take care of him just like he takes care of us. I will make sure he is never lonely again." Elijah's eyes blurred. When Grace stood up, she came right over and took his hand. The other children gathered around, making a circle of this new family they had built from their broken pasts. "We should do this every year," Hannah suggested. That night, Elijah brought them all into the living room. For the first time in a year, Sarah's curtains were open to the sunset. "I need to tell you all something." 7 faces turned to him, full of trust. "A year ago, I was all alone in this big house, just drowning in my sadness. I had lost my wife, and I thought my life was over." He looked at each of them. "Then I went to that train station and saw 7 children wearing labels that told lies about them. And something inside me that I thought had died with Sarah woke right back up. You saved us, Papa, Billy said. No. Elijah shook his head. You all saved me. Every last one of you. By needing me, by trusting me, you gave me a reason to get up in the morning, his voice cracked. I thought I was giving a home to orphans. But the truth is, I was the orphan. I was the one who was lost, and you all found me. The room was quiet. Then Abby climbed into his lap and put her little hand on his chest. Your heart is not sad anymore, Papa. I can feel it. No, sweetheart, it is not sad anymore. Elijah pulled her close and opened his arms for the others. It is full. For the first time in so long, my heart is completely full. They stayed like that as the stars came out. A man who thought he had lost everything, and 7 children who had been told they were nothing, holding on to one another in a house that was finally a home. The labels were long gone, blown away by the Wyoming wind. What mattered was what they had built right here. He looked at his children, at Grace's fierce heart and Sam's quiet strength, and he knew this was exactly where he was meant to be. He was not alone or empty. He was here with them. A family made not by blood, but by choice and by love. In that house, there was warmth and light. There was the beautiful, messy noise of 7 children learning to be loved and 1 man learning to live again. They had found one another in the dark. They had chosen one another when the world said they were not worth choosing. And together they built something that nobody could ever tear down. In the end, the labels did not matter. The past did not matter. What mattered was this moment, this family, this love. What mattered was that 7 children who had been called unwanted were now wanted more than anything. And a broken man had found his reason to live, while 7 lost children had finally found their way home. They were Thorntons now, every single one of them tied together by something a whole lot stronger than blood. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.